Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to call this meeting to order and acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Ojibwe, Cree, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. My name is Carrie Linklater. I am your chairperson this afternoon, and I am joined via Zoom on the panel, Mr. Brian Carlin and Mr. Robert Krause. Our city secretary this afternoon is Mrs. Crystal Harland, and our assessor is Mr. Jason Brown. This afternoon, we will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by City Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the Board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if their matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if their matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the Board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all of the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the Board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the Board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. This afternoon, we will be hearing items 2 and 4 on our docket. And Mrs. Harland, would you please affirm the assessor and the applicant's testimony?
Yes, Madam Chair. Mr. Assessor, would you please state your full name?
Jason Brown.
Thank you. Do you affirm that the evidence you are about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Mr. Applicant, would you please state your full name?
Rod Slaughter.
Thank you. Do you affirm that the evidence you are about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Harland. Good afternoon, Mr. Slaughter and Mr. Brown.
Okay.
We just have 2 items left, which is terrific. I thank you both for your due diligence on that. So we will start off with item number 2, 26 Mandalay Drive, and we are looking at assessed value here. And whenever you're ready, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is file number 24-3404. Roll number is 14064120500, and the civic address is 26 Mandalay Drive. We're defending a 2025 assessed value of $5,888,000 today. This is a flex warehouse consisting of 2 buildings built in 1976 and 77. With wall heights ranging from 17 to 19 feet. We have a leasable area of 52,582 feet and a land to plan ratio of 2.48. I will note that this property was inspected on November 3rd, 2020. Moving to page 3, we have some rental comparables. These range from 1,680 square feet all the way up to 7,583 square feet. We can see the wall heights range from 24 to 11, and the effective year built ranges from 1963 to 1976. To the right of that, we can see the net rents, and there's a range from $7 a square foot to $8 a square foot. Moving to page 4, where we show our income workup for the subject property. So once again, this is a flex warehouse. We have 52,582 square feet with an average rent of $7.32, rounded up to 33 cents. This gives us our potential gross income of 385,271. We've reduced that by 3.5% vacancy, 3% expenses, and $4 per square foot of shortfall. That gives us our NOI of 353,272. And we've capitalized that at 6%, which yields the assessed value of 588,000 or 5,888,000, sorry. On page 5, we have our capitalization rates. I've highlighted the industrial section, which shows a range from the 20th percentile to the 80th percentile. This range is 5.35 up to 7.3. So the subject property does fall squarely in the middle of those. And those are supported to the right of with the outside sources. On page 7, there's a map view showing the location of the subject property and an aerial view below that. Page 8 and 9 show some exterior shots, followed by interior shots on page 10 through to page 15. Income and expense statement located on page 17, 18, and 19. There are 2 rents that were signed during the reference period in 2022 on page 19, and those were $6.25 and $8.25 per square feet. And based on that, we're asking that the assessment be confirmed at 5,888,000, and I'm open for questioning. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, any questions?
Just a few. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Brown. Pretty straight ahead. On page 3, you had a list of comparable rents. They seem to have a range of about $7 to $8 a square foot net, correct?
Correct.
Yes. And then you mentioned that the actual rents also were considered, and you mentioned 2 of them. Would you agree that the majority of the rents, though, are below the range or the market rent that you've applied?
That is correct. However, some of those rents were signed quite some time ago. There's some from 2004, 2011, 2006. So we wouldn't consider those to necessarily be market due to the age of the lease.
Fair enough. The actual sorry?
Yep.
The actual income that you mentioned on page in the income and expense mailers, I think it was page 17. And if we look at page 17, the actual income in place for the property, basically at the reference date, is 247,000 and change, correct?
Correct.
And you would agree that that is substantially lower than the NOI that you cite on page 4 for the assessment of 353,000 and change.
That's correct.
Okay. And then lastly, the capitalization rate, you mentioned 6%. On page 5, I think is the only evidence we have for the capitalization rates. And you show the summaries of the marketing brochures from the brokers in Winnipeg. And would you agree that this would not be a Class A, but rather a Class B industrial property?
Yes.
Okay. So for the range there, it's a low of 6% to a high of 7.5%, depending on the broker. Is that correct?
Correct. With the outside sources, it's falling on the lower end of the spectrum.
Sure. And
bottom.
Do you think this property deserves to be at the lower end of that range of capitalization rate? Is there any reason why you believe that?
We're not relying on those outside sources for our cap rates. Some of the calculations they use are different than some of the calculations we use. Ours are based off sales that we've analyzed. So yeah, they're more there just for support, but it does fall within the middle of our range of 5.35 to 7.3.
Okay. And to confirm, you don't have any of those actual sales and evidence, though, just the broker studies themselves.
That's correct.
Okay, that's all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Carlin, any questions to the assessor?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Kraus?
I have no question for this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, your brief is entirely model-driven, correct?
Yes, the income approach is model driven.
All right, thank you. That is all my questions. Mr.
Thank you.
Slaughter, if you would like to proceed with your brief, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Brown has described the property very well, I think, for the panel, so I'm not going to reiterate much. On page 6 are some overhead maps and photographs of the property from the exterior. A couple things I'd like to point out, though, about the property. This is a flex multi-tenant industrial warehouse. It is located just north of the Inkster Park Industrial Park. It's on the north side of Inkster, in an area which is characterized by a mix of industrial and then some commercial moving into residential. It's 2 different buildings. One is kind of at the back of the site, and the second has a bit more frontage. And the units typically in these sort of properties are a majority warehouse finish, but you will have a build out of maybe 10 to 20%, depending on the size of the unit. So it's pretty standard for industrial. So I think that the main difference, Madam Chair, in our income approaches is twofold. One is we think that only looking at the market rents and not really looking too closely at some of the rents in the actual property may be misleading. And then the second is the capitalization rate. So I'll start with point 1. We have looked at the actual rents in place, and I agree with Mr. Brown. There is a caution that has to be raised when some of the leases appear to be older in nature. So one of the first things we do in that case is try and ascertain, is that actually the commencement date of the lease? Which seems strange because most leases for industrial properties are going to be more like 5 or 10 years. Or is it possible that these are actually commencement dates for the tenancy? And the rent would have either stepped up or renewed. And the way that we test that is if it's a client of ours, is we go back through the previous valuations. And I can see that, in fact, these are not commencement dates of a lease, but rather the occupancy date of the tenant first moving into space. And so we have as an example, the very last unit, W182. It's a small unit that shows $6.50 a square foot is the rent. The date of commencement is 1999. That raises a flag to me. That doesn't seem typical that we'd have a 25-year lease for industrial. And when I go back in time and look at previous years, I see, in fact, that, yeah, the rent has been changing. It's the same tenant, but the rent has been changing over time. And in fact, different commencement dates are stated. It might be 2016. It might be 2013. So it's a caution that we have when we look at a rent roll as completed by the owner in this case, and the owner might actually put a occupancy date rather than commencement. Still, it's older than the most recent leases, and therefore we have to step back a little bit. Mr. Brown had mentioned 2 of the recent leases. There's actually 3, and I missed this myself in my evidence when I prepared it. One rent, as mentioned, is, I'll start from the bottom up. W174 is Daniel's Sharpsmith Canada Limited. You'll see this on page 14. That is a new lease because we can see that the occupancy is actually in late 2020. And they are paying on a 4-year lease, $6.25 a square foot. Right above that, W172 is Edge Electrical Marketing. Approximately the same size, just over 3,000 square feet, commencing in March 2020 for a 5-year lease. That's typical. And they're at $6.25. And the third is near the top. It is Neighborhood Auctions Limited in M36. They are paying the highest rent in the entire building. And when we see that, we sometimes say, well, if that appears to be an outlier, it could be because of landlord investment for tenant improvement allowance or something else. We're not sure. But it is at the highest end of all the rents in the property at $825. So right off the top, I think if 2 of the 3 leases are commanding only $625, I think we're overshooting our market rent potential if we're looking only at comparisons that seem to be in the $7 to $8 range. And my conclusion, Madam Chair, is that I didn't feel any necessity to adjust some of the other rents, again, because we don't believe, or we know that these are not commencement dates for the leases, but rather original occupancy dates. And we have adjusted for the Myers packaging, which doesn't seem to have an end date on it, and guaranteed electrical management, which these were below the range. I thought these were unacceptably low, and we've adjusted those. They were at $4 to $4.75 a square foot. Now, I have a correction to make to my analysis. Originally, we were going to use $625 for those units, adjusting upwards to market from the actual contract. I've changed my mind. Looking again now at the city's evidence and our evidence, I do think that an appropriate rate for these units might be closer to $750. And only for these units, the rest, I believe, are sitting at what should be market because they are an established rent at some point after the occupancy. So if we correct those three rents in blue in the center from $625 to $750, it would bring our blended rent overall to $6.63 a square foot. And that is what I'd like to submit. So again, I think looking at only comparisons of other properties, which we've been cautioned by the municipal board not to do, to ignore actual performance and look to the market instead. And the actual performance is $625, $625, $825 at the upper end. I think we are overshooting the market rent potential if we apply what the city has for their analysis. So we have $6.63 a square foot. We have no other contentions, Madam Chair, in our analysis with the city, except for the capitalization rate. We do have a separate document, which I know everybody on the panel has heard many times, but if you don't mind, I will refer to that very quickly. It should be in evidence. Altus Group 2025 Capitalization Rate Study, Industrial Properties. If the panel could please turn to that. I'll pause until everyone's there.
Yeah. Has everybody located it?
Yeah,
Mr. Carlin?
Just found it. We're good.
All right. You'd like to proceed, Mr. Slaughter?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'll move ahead first to page 6. And what we're doing in this study, Madam Chair, is trying to look at what was happening in the marketplace that would affect the rates of return that investors would require for industrial properties in Winnipeg. And the first thing that we look at, we consider all of the factors that will influence capitalization rate, and there are many. Basically, it's the amount of risk that will influence a annuity income from a property that the investor is willing to take on, that will create a spread between what is called a risk-free investment, like a 10-year bond, and a more illiquid investment like real estate. And depending on the asset, the risk amount of that investment may be higher or lower, so that you will have a larger or smaller spread. You'll always be above the risk-free investment. But to what degree depends on the asset and many characteristics, how much age life there is left in that income before significant capital needs to be invested, the location, the strength of the tenancy or the strength of the covenant. All these different factors are considered. And basically the investor is saying to themselves, what is the risk of sustaining this income annuity that I'm looking at purchasing? Do I think it's going to escalate greatly? In which case you would have a lower capitalization rate. Do I think it's going to stay relatively static? Do I think it will increase because of the laws of supply and demand? And the amount of comfort they have about the escalation of the income will determine the spread over a risk-free investment. So on page 6, we start with the very starting point. What is a risk-free investment at as of April 23? And one of the fundamental driving forces of bond rates, for example, is the overnight rate of the Bank of Canada. And so what we saw happen in the year 2022 is what had been artificially low overnight rates by the Bank of Canada, strictly in reaction to the pandemic, came to an end. And not only did they start increasing, they started increasing rapidly because people realized that we've now entered into a period of inflation. And to try and curb that and control the economy, the Bank of Canada increased their overnight rate significantly. As you can see on page 6, the overnight rate went up over 400 basis points within a very short period of time in 2022. If we turn to page 7, what that meant is that the Bank of Canada bonds, again, usually the proxy that investors use as a risk-free investment, a 10-year bond, they started creeping up as well significantly in 2022. And they were reaching approximately 6%. So I'll pause there. When we're looking at capitalization rates and we're trying to understand the universe in which an investor is looking at the attractiveness of an investment, they are able to turn. Sorry, I mentioned it was 6%. That's the mortgage rate. Sorry, they're able to turn to a risk-free investment at approximately 3.5%. So there has to be a sizable spread over that. The lending rates have gone up to 6%. So that's a bit of background in what we're looking at as the influences on capitalization rates. And we can see on page 8 that, in fact, yes, it does have an effect, although it's a staggered effect. It's a delayed effect. But as we see the bond rate go up, so too will capitalization rates. You can see that starting to happen right at the end of 22 into 23. We really see it on page 9 when we look strictly at industrial cap rates across the country. They are going up considerably. For Class B, they've risen in mid-21 from about 5.25%. Remember, this is across Canada, so including Vancouver and Toronto, who are at much lower cap rates, but it's increasing up to about 6%. And then we look at the same thing that the city did. We look to the broker reports. So I'll just move ahead here, please, to page 15 and 16. This is not a Class A. This would be a Class B property. Why do I say that? Because of its age. The ceiling height is only 17 to 19 feet. Most of the property is actually in the secondary building at the back. All these factors. This is not a Class A. So the brokers are saying, based on their calculations, that the cap rates at this time in Winnipeg should be between 6% to 7.5%. And Mr. Brown is right. You know, that gives us a very good idea, at least from a marketing perspective, of what to expect. But we don't know exactly the sales that are being considered and exactly how those cap rates are being calculated. So the last step, Madam Chair, is that on page 18, we try and find sales that we're able to understand perhaps what the rate of return is. In some of these cases, we have the income in place and we're able to calculate it in the same methodology that we would the subject property valuation. In other cases, we have to impute the cap rate based on an analysis of what we think the appropriate market rates would be. And we've done that with 5 transactions on page 18. And those transactions result in capitalization rates of 6.48%. For a property, a newer property on Burroughs, built in 1992, 6.79% for a property in the Inkster Industrial Park. I think this is quite a good comparison, actually. 1977 to 2005 build. We have a property on Mission in St. Boniface at 7.09%. We have a property on Wall Street that, calculated by our market methodology, comes in rather high at 8.64%. But if I take the actual income stated in the advertisement and I work that backwards to the sale price at 7.3%, still makes sense. What this is doing, Madam Chair, is we've now established what we think should be a range and we're corroborating it with the actual evidence in place. It's basically saying that, yes, you know, give or take a few basis points, what the brokers are saying is probably reasonable, somewhere between 6 to 7.5%. And the last one is a property on Warman Road in St. Boniface at 6.27%. So we feel comfortable that our range is between 6 and 7.5%. But for this property, I see no reason why it would be at the very bottom, the very most optimistic cap rate for an industrial property. In fact, I think the best comparison is 205 Hutchings at 6.79%. So if I may then ask the panel, please, to turn back to our direct evidence. And we'll resume at page 18. Is everyone okay? Okay. On page 18 and 19, we summarize the information that we have in our capitalization rate study. Again, corroborating the opinions of the market by the brokers, by looking at actual sales to the best of our ability, and concluding that this property would not likely be in the low sixes. In fact, it would probably be about 6.75%. The best comparison is Hutchings, which is just south of the subject property at 6.79%. So on page 20, we conclude. Now, if I may, Madam Chair, again, we've made a correction. So I'll just point out the differences in our calculation here with that correction, okay? The blended market rent that we determine now is $6.63 a square foot, which would bring us to a net operating income of $319,167. I'll remind the panel that in the questioning of the assessor, we established that the actual net operating income at the end of 2022 was $247,000. So we are considerably higher at $319,000, but still lower than what the city's applied as a market model-driven value. And then the capitalization rate, we refute the 6% as applied by the model. We apply 6.75%. That would bring us to a revised value, Madam Chair, of $4,728,000. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you. I do have some rebuttal evidence. Oh, no, sorry, I don't for this property. So that concludes our presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Slaughter. Any questions, Mr. Brown?
No questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And Mr. Kraus?
I have no questions right now, thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Carlin?
I just have a small question. There seems to be a very small discrepancy between the leasable area between the city at 52,582 and the Altus number of 52,642. About a 60 square foot difference.
Yeah.
Do we know which one's correct?
Let me see. I believe, and sometimes we'll see this sort of variance, a small variance with multi-tenant properties, but I believe, and I'll just confirm this, the owner had stated 52,642, and that was their sum total of the leasable areas as stated in their income and expense mailer. So, I mean, oftentimes I see this happen. They're rounding as well sometimes, and it might be a little bit off. But I guess the point is that we're putting some weight on the actual rents per square foot. So I would suggest that, we probably should use the 52,642 for that reason, because otherwise
Okay.
we'd have to recalculate all the rents.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Yeah,
That
thank
was
you.
my only question.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, did you have a chance to inspect this property?
I've not.
All right. And anybody else in your office from Altus, if they inspected it?
I can't answer that, Madam Chair. I know we've represented the property for some time, and usually amongst our staff, we try and make sure that somebody from a different asset class group visits the property every few years, but it hasn't been me.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just a general question, and just an opinion, what would be an ideal wall height for a flex warehouse?
24 feet.
I'm sorry?
24 feet is a typical. We find with Inkster Park being predominantly constructed in the 1970s, 60s to 80s, there are two things that we hear about from market participants. One is that in many cases, the ceiling heights are not up to today's standards. And oftentimes people say 30 feet for today's standards, but that's if you have an actual distribution warehouse. For flex warehouse, I think you could be fine in the low 20s. But when you get below 20, it could be seen as not ideal. And then the second thing is the amount of room that trucks have to access the loading bays. And you can see even with this property, it's rather tight together between the two buildings. And so we hear about that turning radius because the trucks at the time were of a different length, a different standard. And I can't remember exactly what it was. But Inkster Park is rather notorious for that, that its turning radiuses are not up to the today's standards.
All right, I thank you.
Thank
Mr. Brown, I'm just going to redirect to you because you did mention that this property had been inspected, correct?
Correct.
Do you have any notes on that inspection?
Not offhand, I don't. I just made note that we were there on November 3rd, 2020.
Okay, so there's no notes on speaking to the condition?
I don't have them in front of me.
All right, I thank you.
Thank you.
Does either party have a wish for a summation?
No, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you both. We will then proceed to 1991 Brookside Boulevard. And again, we are looking at assessed value. And Mr. Brown, if you would like to proceed with your brief.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is file number 24-2905. Roll number is 14098695800. Civic address is 1991 Brookside Boulevard. We're defending a 2025 assessed value of $5,712,000 today. This is classified as a storage warehouse consisting of 3 buildings that are all 1 story. The years built range from 1980 to 2022. There was an addition put on in 2022. The wall heights range from 12 to 20 feet. The land area is 370,890 square feet, with the leasable area at 43,620 feet. And this gives us a land to plan ratio of 8.73. On page 2, I'll note there was a post-reference sale, a few months post-reference. It was a multi-roll sale consisting of 2 adjacent properties, which I can point out when we get to the aerial view. Page 3 shows some rent comparables ranging from 10,556 square feet up to 29,300 square feet. These have average wall heights ranging from 16 to 24 and effective year builds ranging from 1964 to 2015. And we can see the net rents to the right. These range from $8.23 a square foot up to $9 a square foot. On page 4 is the income workup, showing the 43,620 square feet with an average per square foot rent of $8.04. This gives us our potential gross income of $350,532. We've reduced that by 3.5% vacancy, 3% expenses, and $4 per square foot of shortfall. This yields the net operating income of $322,008, and we've capitalized that at 5.65%. There is an additional building value of $13,000. Those are for some gasoline pumps that are located on the subject property. There probably could have been additional land value on this, but we did not add that. So that gives us our assessed value of $5,712,000. Once again, the capitalization rates here on page 5, showing a range from the 20th percentile, 5.35, up to the 80th percentile at 7.3. So this falls towards the 20th percentile at the lower end of the spectrum. I have some map and aerial view on page 7. So the sale, so the subject property is the long rectangle property located at the bottom of that picture. And then the 2 square parcels north, it's the 2 on the right-hand side that were involved in that multi-roll sale. Page 8 shows some aerial views of the 2 buildings. The bottom picture shows the addition that was added in 2020, 2 on the right-hand side of the bottom picture. Some pictures of the gasoline pumps on page 9 and 10. And then some interior shots of the addition on page 11 and 12 and 13, and exterior shot on 14. The permit for the addition on page 15. And then the income and expense statements. This is owner occupied, except for the pumps that are leased to Husky at $42,000 yearly, but there's no area, so we can't generate a rate per square foot on that. So based on that evidence, we'd like to ask that the assessment of $5,712,000 be confirmed, and I am open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions, Mr. Slaughter?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kraus
I have no questions, thank you.
and Mr. Carlin?
No questions, thanks.
Just to confirm again, this was all model driven, Mr. Brown?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you would like to proceed with your brief, Mr. Slaughter.
Madam Chair, I'll ask the panel please to turn straight to page 6, and I'll just go over a few points about the property. Again, Mr. Brown has gone through everything quite well, so there's only a few things to bring up. The property, as Mr. Brown mentioned, was purchased post-reference date. It was actually part of a portfolio, though, that included not only 2 adjacent properties to create a amalgamation, but also properties outside of Manitoba. So it was a portfolio transaction. The subject property is north of Inkster on Brookside Boulevard. And what this means is it's outside of the majority of industrial properties along Brookside and Oak Point. And it's in an area that is actually unserviced. Now, I've been to the property in the past. Mr. Story of our office was out there again in June 2023. He had mentioned that the servicing still is not in place. The property is on a septic system and has a well. But then when I was doing my research, I saw that the city has it with frontage. And I thought, well, that doesn't make sense. So I asked the client that to confirm, is this now serviced? And in fact, it's not. They responded, it is not serviced. My property manager confirmed. The building is on a well and has a septic system. No city infrastructure. This applies to both locations. So we're looking at a relatively remote location. And I think one caution that we need to have when we're looking at comparisons, if we're looking at comparisons to determine, for example, an appropriate market rent, which we should do in this case because we don't have actual rents in place, I have caution about certain locations being superior to something that's a bit more remote. Secondly, I have caution about something that is a completely serviced site versus the subject property, which is not. And thirdly, when we're looking at larger land to building ratios, like we have at the subject property, I have caution between a site that is fully paved versus something that is gravel, like the subject property. So the property has basically 2 main buildings on site. Configured in such a way that I don't think it warrants an adjustment for excess land. We typically make an adjustment for excess land if there is land that is clearly able to be subdivided or there's another purpose for and is not part of the operations of the existing improvements. There is land at the back, but it is being used for the existing operations. And as you can see from the overhead map, it doesn't have access. So for those reasons, what we want to do is try and make sure that the rent comparisons we're looking at also have higher degrees of land to building ratios so that we're not ignoring that fact. So rather than add land, we try and make sure it's recognized in the applied market net operating income. The front building is an older building. We have ample photographs, Madam Chair. I won't go through each one. I'll just refer the board that they are broken down by the types of buildings, and these were taken last year, starting on page 21 and moving through for the two buildings to the end of page 30. The first building is a 14,340 square foot rigid steel building at the front. It's very basic, very Spartan, built in 1980. You can see that doesn't have the best condition at this point. It has a repair shop that's part of the area. The wall height is about 20 feet. The rear building is 24,560 square foot cross dock. And there has been an addition, a warehouse addition, as mentioned by Mr. Brown in 2022, of approximately 12,000 feet. There's about 22 dock level doors, 11 on each side, very small office area. The wall height is 12 feet for the original portion and 20 feet in the warehouse area. Again, the majority of the building was built in 1980, except for that addition at the rear. There is, as mentioned by Mr. Brown, a Husky pad lease. They have a small pumps on site. And from a fee simple perspective, we agree that some value should be attributed, but minor. We don't disagree with the city's application of an RCNLD cost after depreciation of $13,000. And the last point to make is that the property does currently sit on the contaminated and impacted sites list. That is found in our appendix on the very last page. So we move to our income approach on page 12. And again, we have to take into account what we're dealing with here when we look at other properties in the city for comparisons. We're dealing with a property that, yes, has a larger land to building ratio, but is gravel, remotely located, unserviced, and contaminated, or at least impacted. On page 12, we have 16 comparisons. We have photographs of each of the comparisons in the appendix, but I'll just go through a high level on a few of them, Madam Chair. The average of the rent shown here are $7, and some sit out on the high end, and I'll explain why, and some are on the lower end. The very first one is an interesting comparison because it is a higher land to building ratio, like the subject, and it's predominantly gravel, like the subject. So it's a very good comparison in most aspects. It was built in year 2000, though, so it's considerably newer. And it has about 28% office finish, so it's a higher degree of finish. A newer building, higher degree of finish, and it has a rent of $10.25. We would expect that the subject property would be something less than that. The next two comparisons are on Border Street in the St. James industrial area. These are in the heart of the industrial area of St. James. They don't have the land to building ratio. So we're looking at these simply for, minus the land and including services, et cetera, in better locations. What do we see for industrial properties? And these are between $625 and $682 a square foot. The next comparison is interesting because it is a similar type building to the subject buildings, an industrial type building, rigid steel, located just north of the subject on Brookside Boulevard at 1625, built almost the same time as the subject properties, having about 9% office finish like the subject properties. It is a smaller land to building ratio of under 4:1, but it gives us a sense of what the rents in that area might be. It's at $6 a square foot. So I'd like to kind of pinpoint that one for a moment. We have another property on Church that I won't put much weight on. The number 6 comparison is interesting. 2049 Dugald is an industrial, rigid steel industrial building built in 1976 with a 6.52 to 1 land to building ratio. It has access from Dugald and a laneway at the back of the site, so it has 2 access points. It's occupied by a client of ours, Crescent Foods. They pay $4.25 a square foot at the reference date for this property. And part of the reason for the lower rent is the type of construction, the age of construction, and the location being a bit more remote. That's another interesting one. The next comparison also has a sizable land to building ratio. This is 15 Durand in the St. Boniface Industrial Park, 1988 original age. And it pays the rent commanded there is $6.40 a square foot. We now move down to number 10. This is a newer property at 1835 Hecla. It is serviced. It is much smaller. It has a much larger land to building ratio of nearly 11:1, and it commands $9.75 a square foot. And then we come to 1870 King Edward. This is right on King Edward, just north of the tracks. Very good location. And it is about 18,000 square feet, built in 1979. And it commands $10.15 a square foot. So when we look at the best, I'll call the best comparisons, the larger land to building ratios, we have a range of 425 up to 1025. That's quite a wide range. And we feel that the subject property, based on its location, unserviced nature, condition, would fall probably somewhere in the mid-range. So at the bottom of page 12, we have our conclusions. For the majority of the buildings, we apply $6.50 a square foot. And we feel that's appropriate. For the newer building, which is just a rear addition, we do apply a higher rent of $8 a square foot. So that brings our blended rent. And one other thing, there's a small mezzanine area that we've applied. Standard practice by our firm is to apply a half rate to a mezzanine area that's internally accessed and without elevator. So that would be $3.25 a square foot. But I'd like to pause a moment, Madam Chair. The very first comparison I mentioned at 75 Ames, and this is standard in the market, the rent quoted is only based on the main floor. If there's a mezzanine, the market doesn't usually value it. And in fact, at that property, there's a sizable office mezzanine of nearly 4,000 square feet. It's not included. So another reason why the 1025 that we see there, we have to be cautious about. In any event, we've applied a half rate to the mezzanine, and that brings our blended rent overall to $6.84 a square foot. I'll skip ahead, Madam Chair, because we have no contention with the vacancy allowance or the non-recovered expenses. I'll point out that we have added income. The Husky site that the assessor has added for the value of the pumps, they actually are a tenant, and they're paying rent on the pad, a gross rent. So we've included our calculation of the net income from that pad lease at $21,000 per annum. So that's an addition to what the city has done. Lastly comes the capitalization rate. I won't go back to the study that we had, Madam Chair, but I would summarize it by saying this. We saw for Class B, we had a range of 6 to 7.5%. I feel strongly that the city's application of a capitalization rate of I believe it was 5.65% is unwarranted. We feel that it should definitely be in the high 6 range, similar to our analysis and conclusions for Mandalay. But also considering that this is a rather remote location and unserviced and contaminated. These are all factors. Sorry, I used the word contaminated. I should say impacted. These are all factors that the market would consider. And these would be factors that would be pushing that risk analysis basically higher. And therefore, I think the capitalization rate should be no less than 7% for this property. So on page 19, we have our conclusion. We're a little lower than the city on market rent, but for the reasons that I've described, I feel comfortable with that. I do have rebuttal evidence about some of the city's comparisons, Madam Chair, that I'll talk about later. And we've added income for the pad lease, and then we've capitalized the entire income stream at 7%, and it brings us, and we've added the value for the pumps, and it brings us to a total value of $4,216,000 rounded. I think that completes our presentation, Madam Chair. As I mentioned, there's ample pictures for the board's reference of both the subject and the comparisons in the appendix. But I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, any questions?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So just quickly, on page 6, you have the aerial photograph of the subject property. And I believe you stated that there was no road access?
At the back.
Okay, but that lane in between this and the adjacent properties is owned by the city, and it is actually a roadway.
Okay.
Okay, so there is access to the rear. Regarding the servicing, when was your conversation with the owner
It was on February 10th at 8:45 a.m.
of this year?
Yeah, it was just days ago.
Okay, because we have it on record that there was a water line put into this parcel on May 27th, 2022.
That's
So
and I saw that in the city's records, which is why I asked because I was at the site and I knew it was unserviced, but that was a few years ago. So I had a discrepancy here, and I knew that I had to look into this, and that was their answer. Again, to quote, this is February 10th, 2025. My question was, sorry, Carol, one more question. It appears that the site is now fully serviced. Is this correct? I thought it did not have sewer water. Water was sourced from a well and sewage held in septic tanks and pumped out. And the response is, it is not serviced. My property manager confirmed the building is on a well and has a septic system, no city infrastructure. This applies to both locations. That's all I can say, Mr. Brown.
Okay, it's just interesting because we do have a record of them installing this in 2022, and there's quite a bit of information about it. Moving on, your pictures, those were taken before the addition in 2022?
There's two sets of pictures. Some are taken before, I believe, and then the second set were taken in 2023. So there's pictures actually of the addition as well.
Okay. Regarding the impacted status on page 51, it looks like there is a remediation plan that's dated 2023.
Yeah, I'm not aware that anything's happened.
Okay,
It's still on the
There-
list as of when I pulled it.
but there is a plan to remediate it going forward.
Possibly, yeah.
Okay.
And that can be a factor in adjustment for future assessments.
Okay. Your other income on your workup on page 19. I see you use 21,000.
That is correct.
Okay, and how was that calculated? Because I had the income at $42,000 for Husky. Have you just applied a 50% expense ratio?
That's correct. So on page 16, I explained the rationale. Husky leases a small pad site for a fuel pump. The gross rent generated is $3,500 a month, which I think is, you mentioned, is $42 a year. With the owner paying property tax, cleaning, snow, etc. We apply 50% as the expense ratio for an annual net rent of $21,000. So it's an approximation.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. And any questions, Mr. Kraus?
Just a couple. What's the difference between impacted and contaminated? I noticed you corrected yourself.
I really can't answer that question, but I'm careful to, when I cite the description that I had pulled from the list, it reported it as impacted by groundwater. So I didn't want to misuse the term. It is a contaminated sites public registry, but the exact term they use is designated as impacted, designation date April 18th, 2023, contaminants of concern, PHCs, makes sense, and media contaminated groundwater. So I just wanted to be clear about the term actually from the document.
And what is the land to building ratio of the subject property? I think it's
8.73 to 1.
And your comparisons, I'm assuming they're all serviced or are some of them unserviced?
To the best of my knowledge, they are all serviced. You know what? Ames is a question. Let me just pull something up here. Oh, I just had it open, actually. Sorry. Gotta go back. Ames is not serviced.
It is not serviced, okay. Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Carlin?
No question. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, I just have a question in regards to the proportion of the building. This is 3 buildings, and you said, I believe, the majority of the buildings were built in 1980. Do you know sort of what the square footage split would be?
Yeah, on page 7, Madam Chair, I think there's a pretty good photograph that has the areas attributed. So you can see the build. I call it building 1. It's the sort of the building on the left, and it has my eyes aren't that great, but it looks like
4,400.
10,000 plus, yes, approximately. So about 14,000, which I had 14,340. So those are all from 1980. And then the back building is the cross dock. It's kind of in gray, and plus a small office area, kind of on the left-hand side. Those are also 1980. And then the new building in dark blue is that addition that was done in 2022.
So it says new building, but is it the 24,560?
Oh, it's
Is
I think it's 12. I think it's 12,000.
There's no number attached to it. So I'm assuming then the gray rectangular building that's attached to it is also 1980?
Yeah, everything in gray from what I understand is 1980. Certainly those were there when I was at the site before the new building was added. And then the new building is cited as being, I think, 12,320 square feet, and that's in the dark blue.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Okay, that's all my questions. And you have rebuttal?
Yes, I do. Thank you. There's a separate document that should be available for the panel.
Madam Chair, I placed the rebuttal in your shared file.
All
So
right.
should
I
be able
think
to
you-
access it.
Okay, I don't have it, so I'm just going to refresh here for a minute.
Yes.
Thanks, Crystal.
Mr. Assessor, I emailed yours to you.
I have received it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I also have it. And Mr. Carlin? Mr. Carlin, do you have it, the rebuttal?
I'm just opening it up now.
Oh, okay. And Mr. Kraus, I think you have it?
Yes, I have, thank you.
All right. If you would like to proceed, Mr. Slaughter?
So these are the city's rent comparisons, and I think they're all valid. But again, I like to try and look at every one and understand exactly what the property is. So the very first comparison is 1866 King Edward. This is immediately adjacent to a property that we had in our comparisons at 1870 King Edward. And the rent here is $8.53 a square foot. So again, our conclusion for the subject was $6.85 a square foot approximately. And so my question to myself is, does it make sense that we are lower than this comparison? This comparison was built in 1989. It's occupied by Purelator. The land to building ratio is 6.62 to 1. It is a service site. It's approximately 23,190 square feet. According to the city assessment, business assessment records, it has 100% HVAC. So all in all, I would suggest that yes, this is a superior property. Should it be higher than the subject property? Yes. To what degree? That's a subjective opinion. The next comparison is 1695 Sargent, and that's on page 3. We have a photograph. This is more of a wholesaler. It's occupied by Robertson Electric. They're a wholesaler, and you can see it almost has a sort of a quasi commercial look, and it's located in more of a commercial location of in St. James. So it doesn't have the land to building at all, but I do expect that this type of property is going to command a higher rent than the subject property, and it's at $8.25 a square foot. The next comparison is 944 Henry. This is more akin to the subject again. It has a larger land to building ratio. In this case, it's 4.55 to 1, but it's a new building. It was built in 2015. You can see a photograph of it here. So again, I would expect that this would be higher than the subject property. It's at $8.82 a square foot. And then almost like a ping pong effect, we're going to, the next comparison is more like number 2. This is 1199 St. James. This is a client of ours. It was vacant until 2022. MCO occupied the majority of the building in 2022. They're paying $8.23 a square foot. But again, this is in the heart of St. James. This is on St. James and I believe Wellington Avenue. And they're more of a wholesaler. So I would expect that it would be a higher rent. The next comparison is 1130 King Edward. And this isn't a client, so I wasn't able to determine exactly what is included in this tenant's rent. It appears that on the overhead map you'll see on page 6 that they're the building in the top left. I assume they're a separate tenant than the others. But it is a very large site with lots of land access. So I don't know what portion of that would be attributed, but it's sizable anyway. So otherwise, I think this would be a decent comparison, but in a superior location. The next comparison is back to this idea of more in the St. James area. It's occupied by Master Rentals. We represent this property and we had indications that we weren't sure if the rent was arm's length. We did a market analysis instead. And according to the City of Winnipeg Business Assessment, it does have a high degree of HVAC. But again, it's more of a commercial or quasi-commercial industrial location. And then the last comparison is 1256 Sherwin. This is occupied by Benjamin and Moore as a warehouse for their paint inventory. It's just again, kind of more of a superior located industrial property. I don't have any other information on that. So I think when we look at locations, age, all these factors, my conclusion is that these are good comparisons, but we would need to adjust downwards. And to what degree, that's subjective, but I do still feel that our comparisons and our conclusions have weight. So that concludes our rebuttal.
I thank you. Mr. Brown, any questions in regards to this?
I have no questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Carlin?
And just to clarify, all these recent or these properties in the rebuttal, they're all serviced, right?
From what I understand, they're mostly centrally located, so I would almost definitely say yes.
And that was my only question. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Kraus?
I have no questions, thank you.
And I have no questions. Does either party have a wish for a summation? Mr. Brown?
No, thank you.
And Mr. Slaughter?
Yes, very quickly. I think we've gone through the market rent. It's different of opinions, but I feel fairly confident in our conclusions. But the capitalization rate definitely warrants adjustment. Mr. Brown, I'll ask a favor. If you can send me whatever you have, I'm going to send it back to the owner and make sure that everything is up to date. Again, this is a response from them days ago, and this is from their on-site manager. But I want to find out why we have a discrepancy here.
Just to be clear about the servicing?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. And that's all. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. We have heard both items on our docket this afternoon, and this hearing is now adjourned. And I would like to thank Mr. Slaughter and Mr. Brown for their briefs and time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
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 Madam Chair, I'll go take us offline now.
Thank you.
Hold on, please.
Panel, I'm just going to suggest we take 5 minutes before we begin deliberations.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Sounds good, Carrie. Thanks.